battling against plans for wind farms near their homes have won an important new ally. The National Trust has this week described large wind turbines as a menace. But hostility towards wind farms hasn't deterred landowners from maximising their potential. A wind energy seminar in Norfolk today was sold out as investors go in search of cheaper ways to keep the lights on.
Around 100 farmers have come here to Easton College near Norwich today to find out about small-scale renewable energy projects. Wind, solar power, ground source heat pumps. But with the UK struggling to meet its renewable energy targets, are small-scale renewable energy projects at best a distraction and at worst an irrelevance? Small-scale wind power. It's an increasingly common sight.
In the future, we will be dependent on gas from Russia. So
farmers today were told there's only one way energy prices are heading, and that's up. Renewable energy systems could help cushion the blow.
We mill our own feed, so we're obviously using power for the mill. And then at Christmas time we have cold stores running as well. So.
But I think if I'm going to do it, I want it to be my windmill. I don't want to pay for it myself and benefit from government subsidies.
This farm gets free electricity for providing the land for 2 turbines. The installer pays the capital cost and receives the government's wind power subsidy payments.
These are 5 kilowatt systems, so they're about the right size to feed into a typical large country house or a farmhouse, and they will cover about half of the electricity usage of a typical farmhouse.
But is such small-scale generation really worth the trouble and the expense? This energy expert says there's a critical point to consider.
One thing we must think about is that whenever we use electricity, 8.5% of the electricity we use is lost in the transmission lines coming from the power station. If you can actually generate it locally, you automatically boost the effective amount by 8.5%.
Farmers at today's conference were clear about 2 things. The way they acquire and use energy will have to change. This turbine behind me is relatively small. It only stands at about 15 metres high. But larger turbines are now becoming increasingly controversial. In Northamptonshire, local councils have rejected applications for several wind farms, only to have those rejections overturned on appeal by a government planning inspector. And now, another row is brewing. As Stuart Ratcliffe reports.
Lyveden New Build is a Grade 1 listed building in the heart of the Northamptonshire countryside. But currently a planning inspector is considering an application to build 4 126-metre high turbines less than a mile from here at Barnwell Manor.
Certain views they would tower over Lyveden New Build. Also they would be by far the highest structure on the landscape. The fact that they're a moving structure would draw attention to them and detract from the other features of the landscape.
And this site isn't the only application in the pipeline. Currently, planning inspectors have approved turbines at 4 sites where local councils had originally refused permission. Appeals are also ongoing at 5 other sites, and if all these turbines are granted permission, together with existing wind farms, there'll be a total of 121 turbines across this county alone. And some say Northamptonshire is becoming the wind farm capital of England because of hugely inflated government subsidies.
It can only be because of the level of subsidies, because Northamptonshire's got the lowest wind speeds in Britain. Central England has low wind speeds, and the high wind speeds are around the coast, and so it's got to be down to excess subsidies.
West Coast Energy, which is behind this application, said wind farms contribute to the government's renewable energy targets and climate change commitments. The company and the campaigners are now waiting to hear the decision of the inspector, which is due at the end of the month. Stuart Ratcliffe, BBC Look East at Lyveden New Build.
The UK is already struggling to meet its renewable energy targets, and later this year the subsidies for wind power are expected to be cut. It'll make the job of hitting those targets even harder.
So where does that leave the future of wind power? Well, I'm joined by Dr. Keith Tovey from the University of East Anglia. Let's start with that government target, 30% of our electricity to be produced by renewables by 2020. At the moment, I think we're on about 5 or 6%.
Somewhere about that, yes.
We've got a long way to go.
We indeed have. We've been so tardy in the past in actually moving forward on this area.
Are we going to make it?
It's going to be tough. but in fact we need to be moving in this direction if we want to have a secure supply of electricity for the future.
At the moment, subsidies for wind power are costing somewhere in the region of, well, hundreds of millions of pounds a year. Is it worth it?
Well, it is actually only affecting our bills by about 2% maximum. I know our domestic costs have gone up significantly, but that's not been because of the subsidies, as many people think. It's because the fossil fuel price of gas, which we now have to import because we're running out, have gone up so dramatically in the past, and they will continue to do so in the future.
I want to talk to you about the offshore-onshore debate. If we just concentrated on building wind farms offshore, A, I guess there'd be more wind, and B, we wouldn't have this local opposition.
Indeed, there is more wind offshore, but the cost is significantly higher to build offshore, and it would cost about 50% more for our electricity if we took offshore wind rather than onshore wind. So if we're prepared to pay, fine, that would be the way forward. There is another aspect, as it was mentioned earlier in the programme, that in fact if we can have it in our own villages, then we don't have the loss of 8.5 to 10% of the electricity coming all the way from offshore.
But also, as we saw in that report, people don't want it in their own villages, do they?
They don't, but in fact, it's got to come from somewhere. We've got to have electricity from somewhere. Perhaps what we should have is that those people who are prepared to have them should have a discount on their electricity compared with those who actually don't want it.
An interesting idea. Dr. Keith Tovey, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.